The dust kicked up by the stagecoach had barely settled when two small figures emerged from behind the water trough. 8-year-old Samuel clutched his sister Sarah's hand as they watched the last connection to their old life disappear down Main Street. The twins had traveled 3 days from Kansas City with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a crumpled letter bearing the name of their destination, Redemption Creek, Colorado Territory. Their parents had perished in a house fire 2 weeks prior, leaving them with distant relatives who wanted nothing to do with extra mouths to feed. Now they stood alone on the wooden boardwalk, their wide eyes taking in the bustling frontier town that would either welcome them or cast them out like so many others before. Martha Whitfield heard the commotion from her general store and stepped onto the porch, her weathered hands still dusted with flour from the morning's baking. At 45, she had been widowed for 3 years since her husband Benjamin fell to consumption, leaving her to run their modest business alone. The sight of the 2 children standing uncertainly in the street tugged at something deep in her chest, a maternal instinct she thought had died with her own stillborn child years ago. She had grown accustomed to the loneliness that echoed through her small house behind the store, but seeing these lost souls stirred memories of dreams she had buried. Without hesitation, she descended the steps and approached the twins, her voice gentle despite the roughness that frontier life had carved into her features. "So you children look like you could use a hot meal and a safe place to rest," Martha said, kneeling to meet their eyes. Samuel straightened his thin shoulders, trying to appear older than his years, while Sarah peered out from behind her brother's protective stance. Their clothes were travel-stained and too thin for the approaching Colorado winter, and Martha could see the exhaustion etched in their young faces. When Samuel finally spoke, his voice cracked with the weight of responsibility no child should bear. "Mom, we're looking for work and a place to stay," he said, his chin lifted with determined pride despite the tears threatening to spill. "We can sweep and clean and help with whatever needs doing." The other townspeople had begun to gather, drawn by curiosity and the unusual sight of unaccompanied children in their remote settlement. Judge Harrison Caldwell emerged from his office across the street, his imposing figure casting a long shadow as he surveyed the scene. At 62, he had presided over this corner of the territory for nearly 2 decades, his reputation for fairness tempered by an unwavering adherence to the letter of the law. His steel-gray eyes missed nothing as he observed Martha's obvious attachment to the children and the way they instinctively sought her protection. The judge had seen too many cases of good intentions gone wrong, and his expression remained carefully neutral as he approached the small group. "These children have no legal guardian in this territory," Judge Caldwell announced, his voice carrying the authority that had settled countless disputes. "According to territorial law, they must be placed under proper supervision until suitable arrangements can be made." Martha felt her heart sink at his words, knowing that suitable arrangements often meant an orphanage in Denver or worse, separation of the siblings. She looked down at Sarah, who had begun to tremble, and Samuel, whose jaw was set in defiant determination. The boy stepped forward, his small hand still protecting his sister, and looked directly at the judge with a courage that surprised even the hardened adults watching. "Your Honor, we just need someone willing to give us a chance," Samuel said, his voice steady despite his fear. Dr. William Hayes pushed through the growing crowd, his medical bag in hand, and concern etched across his kind features. He had delivered half the babies in Redemption Creek and tended to their ailments, earning him a respected voice in community matters. "Judge, surely we can find a temporary solution while proper paperwork is arranged," he suggested, glancing meaningfully at Martha. The widow had helped nurse his own wife through a difficult fever the previous winter, and he knew her to possess both the practical skills and gentle heart these children needed. His words carried weight in the community, and several other residents began to murmur their agreement, though others remained skeptical of taking on the responsibility of orphaned children. Sheriff Tom Bradley adjusted his badge as he studied the situation, his lawman's instincts warring with his human compassion. He had seen what happened to children left to fend for themselves on the frontier. Some turned to petty theft, others simply disappeared into the vast wilderness never to be seen again. These two seemed different, though. There was something in their bearing that spoke of good upbringing despite their current circumstances. "The boy's got spirit," he observed quietly to the judge, "and the girl looks bright as a silver dollar." His endorsement meant something in a town where his word was law, second only to the judge's, and Martha felt a flicker of hope at his measured assessment. Reverend Marcus Stone stepped forward from the crowd, his weathered Bible clutched in one hand and his worn hat in the other. The preacher had baptized most of the town's children and buried their elders, making him a moral compass in the sometimes lawless territory. "The good book tells us to welcome the stranger and care for the orphan," he said softly, his voice carrying despite its gentleness. "Martha Whitfield has proven herself a woman of strong character and Christian virtue." His words brought nods from several women in the crowd, though Martha herself seemed surprised by the public endorsement of her worthiness as a guardian. The Reverend's support carried considerable influence in their close-knit community, where Sunday services were often the week's most important social gathering. Young Emily Patterson, the schoolteacher who had arrived from Boston just 6 months prior, stepped closer to examine the children with a professional eye. At 24, she had already seen the challenges facing frontier education, particularly the irregular attendance of children whose labor was needed for family survival. "These children appear intelligent and well-mannered," she observed, noting Sarah's careful attention to the adult conversation and Samuel's protective instincts. "With proper schooling, they could contribute meaningfully to our community's future." Her assessment carried particular weight, given the territory's emphasis on education as a mark of civilization, and her words added another layer of respectability to the children's case before the judge. As the sun began its descent toward the mountain peaks, Judge Caldwell raised his hand for silence, knowing that a decision could not be delayed much longer. The children needed shelter before nightfall, and the growing crowd of townspeople awaited his ruling on this unprecedented situation. Martha stepped closer to the twins, her protective instincts overriding any concern for proper legal procedures, while Samuel and Sarah looked up at her with expressions that mixed hope and fear in equal measure. The judge's next words would determine not only the immediate fate of 2 orphaned children, but would set a precedent for how their small community would handle such matters in the future. In that moment, with the entire town watching, the true character of Redemption Creek would be revealed through the wisdom or folly of its most important decision-maker. "I'll need to examine all aspects of this situation before making any permanent arrangements," Judge Caldwell declared, his tone measured and deliberate. Martha felt her shoulders tense at his words, recognizing the careful legal language that often preceded decisions that prioritized procedure over compassion. She had known Harrison Caldwell since his arrival in Redemption Creek, and while she respected his fairness, she also knew his tendency to follow territorial regulations to the letter. The twins seemed to sense the gravity of his statement, with Sarah pressing closer to her brother and Samuel straightening his spine in preparation for whatever judgment might come. The judge's reputation for thorough deliberation meant they might be waiting days or even weeks for a final decision, time that could be crucial for their adjustment to their new circumstances. Martha surprised herself by stepping forward boldly, her voice carrying a strength she hadn't felt since her husband's death. "Your Honor, I formally request to serve as temporary guardian for Samuel and Sarah," she announced, loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. The words came from a place deeper than conscious thought, driven by an instinct she hadn't felt in years of quiet widowhood. She felt the weight of the community's attention as whispers rippled through the gathered townspeople, some supportive and others skeptical of a single woman's ability to raise 2 children. Her hands trembled slightly as she realized the magnitude of what she had just proposed, but the grateful look in the children's eyes strengthened her resolve. This was perhaps the most important decision she had made since choosing to stay in Redemption Creek after Benjamin's death, rather than returning to her sister's family in Ohio. Samuel looked up at Martha with an expression that mixed surprise with cautious hope, his young mind processing the possibility that this kind stranger might truly be willing to take them in. He had learned to be suspicious of adult promises after their relatives' rejection, but something in Martha's bearing spoke of genuine sincerity rather than mere pity. "Ma'am, we don't want to be a burden," he said quietly, his voice carrying the premature wisdom of a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly. "Sarah and I can work hard, and we won't cause trouble." His protective arm around his sister never wavered, even as he dared to hope that they might finally find the safety and stability they had lost with their parents' death. The boy's maturity impressed even the judge, who had seen many cases of children far older, who lacked Samuel's sense of responsibility. Sarah finally found her voice, soft and sweet despite the ordeal she had endured, and her words carried an innocence that tugged at every adult heart present. "We know our letters and numbers," she offered shyly, looking between Martha and the imposing judge. "Samuel taught me, and I can help with cooking and cleaning like Mama showed me." Her small hands smoothed her travel-worn dress as she spoke, a gesture of dignity that revealed the good upbringing she had received before tragedy struck their family. Martha felt her heart clench at the child's eagerness to prove her worthiness, recognizing in Sarah's words an echo of her own childhood desire to be useful and valued. The little girl's brave attempt to demonstrate her capabilities despite her obvious exhaustion showed a resilience that spoke well of her character and potential. Dr. Hayes stepped closer to the judge, his medical training giving him insight into the children's physical and emotional state that others might miss. "These children have endured significant trauma, Harrison," he said quietly, using the judge's first name in a way that indicated their long friendship. "They need stability and care, not bureaucratic delays that could compound their psychological wounds." His professional opinion carried considerable weight in their frontier community, where medical expertise was scarce and highly valued. The doctor had seen too many cases where well-meaning legal procedures had inadvertently caused more harm than good, particularly with vulnerable children who needed immediate care and attention. His advocacy for swift action, rather than prolonged deliberation, reflected both his medical knowledge and his understanding of human nature, developed through years of frontier practice. The schoolteacher, Emily Patterson, found herself studying the twins with growing admiration for their composure and obvious intelligence despite their difficult circumstances. She had taught children from various backgrounds during her brief tenure in Redemption Creek, and these two displayed qualities that suggested they would thrive given proper support and guidance. "I would be honored to ensure their education continues without interruption," she offered, her Boston accent softening with genuine emotion. "Children of their age need consistency and structure, especially during such a difficult transition." Her words added practical weight to Martha's request, addressing potential concerns about the children's schooling and future prospects in their frontier community. The teacher's support also indicated her willingness to take personal responsibility for the twins' intellectual development, removing that burden from Martha's shoulders. Sheriff Bradley cleared his throat and addressed the judge with the directness that had served him well in law enforcement throughout the territory. "I've investigated the children's background since they arrived," he announced, producing a telegraph message from his vest pocket. "Their story checks out. Parents died in a house fire in Kansas City, no relatives willing to take them in." His confirmation of their circumstances eliminated any doubts about potential fraud or deception, establishing the twins' legitimacy as genuine orphans in need of care. The sheriff's endorsement also carried implications about his willingness to ensure the children's safety and well-being if placed in Martha's care. His practical assessment of their situation helped move the discussion from emotional appeals to factual considerations that would influence the judge's eventual decision. Reverend Stone approached the small group with the gentle authority that made him a trusted counselor to his congregation during times of crisis and celebration alike. "Martha, I've watched you demonstrate Christian charity and practical wisdom throughout the years I've known you," he said warmly, his words carrying both personal endorsement and spiritual blessing. "Your home would provide these children with both moral guidance and loving care." His statement served as both character reference and religious sanction for Martha's proposal, addressing potential community concerns about a widow's ability to provide proper guidance for growing children. The Reverend's support also indicated his willingness to offer ongoing spiritual counsel and assistance if needed, creating a network of community support rather than placing the entire burden on Martha alone. His endorsement carried particular weight in their frontier settlement, where religious guidance often provided the moral framework for difficult decisions. Judge Caldwell studied the faces around him, recognizing the unusual unity of support for Martha's proposal from the community's most respected leaders and citizens. In his 2 decades of frontier jurisprudence, he had rarely seen such consensus on a complex custody matter, particularly one involving an unmarried woman seeking to adopt orphaned children. The legal precedent was murky at best, with territorial regulations offering little specific guidance for such unusual circumstances in remote settlements. His training told him to err on the side of caution and seek guidance from territorial authorities in Denver, but his experience with frontier life suggested that immediate action might serve these children better than bureaucratic delays. The weight of his decision pressed heavily upon him, as he realized that his ruling would not only affect 2 orphaned children, but would establish how their community would handle similar situations in the future. As evening shadows lengthened across Main Street and the mountain air grew crisp with approaching night, Judge Caldwell raised his hand one final time to address the assembled townspeople and announce his preliminary decision. The crowd fell silent with anticipation, understanding that this moment would define not only the fate of two orphaned children, but the character of their entire community. Martha felt her heart racing as she prepared to hear words that would either fulfill her unexpected maternal longings or dash her hopes of providing the stable home these children desperately needed. Samuel and Sarah moved closer to her instinctively, their young hearts having already chosen her as their protector, regardless of what legal pronouncements might follow. In that hushed moment before the judge spoke, the true bonds of family seemed to transcend the formal requirements of law and regulation, suggesting that some decisions of the heart carry more weight than any written statute. "Before I render any decision regarding permanent custody," Judge Caldwell announced, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "I must inform you all of a complication that has just come to my attention." He held up a telegram that had been delivered during the proceedings, his expression grave as he studied its contents. The crowd shifted uneasily, sensing that this unexpected development might change everything they had witnessed and hoped for regarding the twins' fate. Martha felt her stomach drop as she recognized the official seal on the document, knowing that territorial communications often brought unwelcome news that could override local decisions. The judge's careful legal mind was clearly working through implications that the rest of them could not yet foresee, and his measured tone suggested that the situation had become far more complex than anyone had imagined. "This telegram is from the Territorial Child Welfare Agency in Denver," the judge continued, his words falling like stones into the expectant silence. "They have been notified of the children's arrival in our jurisdiction and are dispatching an inspector to evaluate placement options." The crowd erupted in surprised murmurs as the implications of outside interference became clear to everyone present. Martha felt the color drain from her face as she realized that bureaucratic officials who had never met the twins or their community might now determine their fate based solely on written regulations and territorial policies. Samuel's grip tightened protectively around his sister's shoulders, his young mind understanding enough to recognize this as a threat to the safety they had begun to hope for. The unity that had seemed to guarantee their placement with Martha suddenly felt fragile in the face of distant authority that operated by different rules and priorities. Dr. Hayes stepped forward with barely contained frustration, his usual diplomatic manner strained by what he saw as unnecessary interference in a matter the community was perfectly capable of handling. "Harrison, surely our assessment of what's best for these children carries more weight than some bureaucrat's checklist from Denver," he argued, his voice rising with indignation. "We know Martha, we know this community, and we can see with our own eyes that these children have already begun to form healthy attachments." His medical training had taught him the importance of emotional stability for traumatized children, and he feared that additional upheaval would cause psychological harm that might take years to heal. The doctor's passionate advocacy surprised even himself, as he rarely involved himself so directly in legal matters, but something about this situation had awakened his protective instincts as both physician and community member. Sheriff Bradley's hand moved instinctively to his badge as he considered the territorial implications of outside interference in local affairs, his law enforcement experience making him wary of distant authorities who might not understand frontier realities. "Judge, I've had dealings with that agency before," he said grimly, his voice carrying the weight of unpleasant experience. "They're more concerned with following procedures than finding actual homes for children." His words carried an ominous undertone that made several townspeople exchange worried glances, recognizing the sheriff's reputation for straight talk about uncomfortable truths. The lawman had seen too many cases where territorial bureaucracy had resulted in outcomes that served regulations better than human needs, and his concern reflected the frontier community's general mistrust of distant governmental oversight. His warning suggested that the twins might face a far less certain future than the loving home Martha was prepared to offer. Martha surprised everyone, including herself, by stepping directly in front of the judge and speaking with a quiet intensity that commanded attention despite her soft tone. "Your Honor, I don't care what some inspector from Denver thinks about my fitness as a guardian," she declared, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "These children have already been through enough upheaval, and I won't stand by and watch them be shuffled around like cargo while bureaucrats debate their future." Her words carried the fierce protection of a mother defending her young, and the crowd recognized something fundamental had changed in the mild-mannered widow they thought they knew. The transformation from quiet shopkeeper to determined advocate revealed depths of character that even her longtime neighbors hadn't suspected, and her willingness to challenge both judge and territorial authority on behalf of the twins impressed everyone present. Reverend Stone placed a gentle but firm hand on Martha's shoulder, his pastoral instincts recognizing both her righteousness and the need for diplomatic wisdom in dealing with territorial authorities. Perhaps we should consider this an opportunity to demonstrate that our community's values produce better outcomes than distant regulations, he suggested tactfully. If we can show the inspector that these children have found not just a home, but an entire community committed to their welfare, surely that would carry significant weight. His words offered a path forward that honored both Martha's determination and the judge's legal obligations, suggesting cooperation rather than confrontation as the most effective strategy. The Reverend's ability to find middle ground in difficult situations had served their community well in previous crises, and his calm wisdom provided a stabilizing influence when emotions threatened to override practical considerations. Samuel stepped forward with a maturity that startled the adults, his young voice carrying a determination that commanded respect, despite his small stature. "Your Honor, Sarah and I have been passed around enough," he said clearly, his arm never leaving his sister's shoulders. "We know a good home when we see one, and we want to stay with Miss Martha." His simple declaration carried the weight of lived experience and genuine affection, cutting through legal complexities with the clarity of child's honest assessment. The boy's willingness to speak up for himself and his sister demonstrated the kind of character that impressed even the most skeptical adults, and his obvious bond with Martha was evident to everyone present. His words also carried the implication that the children themselves should have some voice in determining their own fate, a concept that challenged traditional assumptions about children as passive recipients of adult decisions. Emily Patterson found herself moved to action by the boy's courage, stepping forward to add her professional assessment to the growing resistance against territorial interference. As their potential teacher, I can attest that these children need stability and continuity more than they need perfect compliance with bureaucratic procedures, she declared, her Boston education lending authority to her words. Educational research clearly demonstrates that traumatized children thrive best in environments where they feel secure and valued. Her academic credentials and professional training provided a different kind of expertise than the others had offered, suggesting that modern educational theory supported the community's instinctive response to the twins' needs. The schoolteacher's advocacy also indicated her personal commitment to ensuring the children's intellectual development would continue uninterrupted, regardless of the territorial inspector's eventual decision. As if summoned by their discussion, a dust cloud appeared on the eastern road leading into town, and Sheriff Bradley's keen eyes identified the official territorial vehicle approaching at a pace that suggested urgent business. "Looks like our inspector is arriving ahead of schedule," he announced grimly, his hand unconsciously checking his weapon as frontier lawmen did when facing uncertain situations. The crowd turned as one to watch the approaching carriage, their earlier unity now tempered by apprehension about what this outside authority might mean for the twins' future. Martha instinctively drew the children closer to her side, her protective instincts overriding any concern for proper legal protocol, as she prepared to face whatever challenges this territorial representative might bring. The approaching confrontation would test not only Martha's determination, but the entire community's commitment to protecting two vulnerable children who had already found their place among them. Judge Caldwell straightened his shoulders and adjusted his coat, preparing to receive the territorial inspector with the dignity befitting his office, while privately hoping that local wisdom would prevail over distant bureaucracy. "Whatever happens next," he said quietly to Martha, his formal tone softening slightly, "know that this community's support for you and these children has been noted and will be part of any official record." His words offered both warning and encouragement, suggesting that while he must follow legal procedures, he was not unsympathetic to their cause. The judge's acknowledgement of community sentiment indicated that the inspector would face unified local opposition rather than a simple custody case, potentially complicating whatever predetermined plans the territorial agency might have for Samuel and Sarah. As the official carriage drew closer, everyone present understood that the real test of their convictions was about to begin. and the outcome would determine whether frontier communities could still determine their own moral destiny in matters of the heart. The territorial carriage rolled to a stop in front of the courthouse, and Inspector Margaret Thornton emerged with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations across the Colorado Territory. At 58, she had spent 15 years evaluating child placement cases, her reputation built on strict adherence to territorial guidelines, regardless of local sentiment or emotional appeals. Her severe grey dress and wire-rimmed spectacles gave her an austere appearance that immediately set the townspeople on edge, and her quick, assessing glance at the assembled crowd suggested she was accustomed to encountering resistance to her authority. Martha felt her heart sink as she recognized the type of bureaucratic official who valued procedure over people, but she kept the twins close to her side with determination that surprised her with its intensity. The inspector's arrival had transformed what seemed like a community celebration into a formal legal proceeding with uncertain outcomes. "Judge Caldwell, I trust you have maintained proper temporary custody protocols pending my evaluation," Inspector Thornton announced without preamble, her clipboard already in hand and her pen poised to record any irregularities she might observe. Her tone carried the implicit criticism of local officials who might prioritize sentiment over proper procedure, and her immediate focus on documentation rather than the children themselves revealed her approach to what she clearly viewed as a routine administrative matter. The crowd stirred uneasily at her impersonal manner, recognizing that she saw Samuel and Sarah not as individuals with specific needs, but as case files to be processed according to territorial regulations. Martha stepped protectively in front of the twins, her maternal instincts overriding any intimidation she might feel from the inspector's official authority. The inspector's coldly professional demeanor stood in stark contrast to the warm community support the children had already experienced, making the stakes of this encounter crystal clear to everyone present. Judge Caldwell maintained his judicial composure despite his growing concern about the inspector's apparent inflexibility, recognizing that diplomacy would serve the children's interests better than confrontation. "Inspector Thornton, these children arrived only today, and the community has rallied admirably to address their immediate needs," he began carefully, hoping to establish the positive context before she formed negative impressions. "Mrs. Whitfield has volunteered to serve as temporary guardian, with full community support and endorsement from our local professionals." His words attempted to frame the situation as exemplary community cooperation rather than irregular procedure, but the inspector's expression remained skeptically neutral. The judge's experience with territorial officials told him that first impressions would be crucial in determining whether local preferences would carry any weight in the final decision. His careful choice of words reflected both his legal training and his growing appreciation for the genuine bonds that had already formed between Martha and the twins. Inspector Thornton approached Samuel and Sarah with the clinical detachment of someone who had interviewed hundreds of children in similar circumstances, her questions designed to elicit standard responses rather than understand their individual personalities. "Children, I need you to tell me about your living arrangements and any adults who have offered you assistance," she said formally, her pen ready to record their answers according to predetermined categories on her forms. Samuel straightened his shoulders and looked directly at her with the honest courage that had impressed every adult he had encountered, his protective arm still around his sister's shoulders. "Ma'am, Miss Martha has been kind to us, and everyone here has made us feel welcome," he replied clearly, his young voice carrying a dignity that momentarily gave the inspector pause. Sarah nodded agreement while staying close to her brother, her shy smile directed not at the inspector but at Martha, whose presence had become their anchor of safety in an uncertain world. Dr. Hayes stepped forward with his medical bag in hand, his professional credentials giving him standing to address the inspector as a colleague rather than merely another concerned townsperson. "Inspector Thornton, I must emphasize the medical importance of maintaining stability for children who have suffered recent trauma," he said firmly, his tone carrying the authority of expert medical opinion. "These children have already begun forming healthy emotional attachments that would be psychologically harmful to disrupt without compelling cause." His clinical language was calculated to appeal to her bureaucratic mindset while advocating for the twins' emotional welfare, and his willingness to put his professional reputation behind his assessment added significant weight to his words. The inspector paused in her note-taking to study him more carefully, recognizing that his medical expertise created complications for any simple administrative solution she might prefer. His advocacy represented the kind of professional opinion that could complicate her report to territorial authorities if she chose to ignore local recommendations. Martha found herself speaking with a clarity and determination that surprised everyone who had known her as a quiet widow, her voice carrying the fierce protection of a mother defending her children against any threat. "Inspector, I don't know what your forms say about proper guardianship, but I know what I see in these children's eyes," she declared passionately. "They've found safety here, and they've chosen me just as much as I've chosen them." Her words cut through bureaucratic language to the emotional heart of the matter, and several townspeople murmured agreement with her assessment. The inspector's pen paused over her clipboard as she encountered something her forms had no category for: genuine love that had transcended legal procedures and official requirements. Martha's transformation from mild-mannered shopkeeper to fierce advocate demonstrated the depth of commitment that no regulation could adequately measure or evaluate. Reverend Stone stepped forward with his worn Bible in hand, his gentle authority providing spiritual weight to the community's collective advocacy for the twins' placement with Martha. "Inspector, our faith teaches us that families are formed by love and commitment, not merely by legal documents," he said softly, his words carrying the moral authority that had guided their community through previous crises. "These children have found their family here, and we have found our purpose in caring for them." His religious perspective offered an alternative framework for evaluating the situation that transcended territorial regulations, suggesting that spiritual and moral considerations should influence decisions about children's welfare. The inspector found herself facing not just individual preferences, but an entire community's unified conviction that love and local support created better outcomes than distant bureaucratic oversight. His words challenged her to consider whether territorial efficiency truly served children better than community commitment and genuine affection. Inspector Thornton looked around at the assembled townspeople, her experienced eye recognizing something unprecedented in her 15 years of similar evaluations: an entire community united in support of an unconventional but genuine family formation. Her clipboard felt suddenly heavy in her hands as she realized that her standard procedures had no framework for evaluating the kind of organic community support she was witnessing. The children's obvious comfort with Martha, the professional endorsements from local leaders, and the unified community commitment created a situation her training had never prepared her to handle. For the first time in years of bureaucratic efficiency, she found herself questioning whether territorial regulations truly served children's interests better than the kind of authentic care and support she was observing. Her pen remained poised over her forms, but her certainty about proper procedures began to waver in the face of evidence that contradicted everything her experience had taught her about frontier communities and child welfare. Judge Caldwell sensed the inspector's moment of uncertainty and spoke with careful authority, recognizing this as the crucial moment that would determine the twins' future and their community's autonomy in matters of the heart. "Inspector Thornton, I formally recommend that Samuel and Sarah be placed permanently in Martha Whitfield's custody, with full community support and professional oversight," he announced, his judicial authority lending weight to what had begun as emotional appeal. "This decision serves both the children's best interests and demonstrates that local communities can provide superior outcomes to institutional alternatives." His words transformed the discussion from emotional pleading to official legal recommendation, giving the inspector bureaucratic cover for approving what her heart was beginning to tell her was the right decision. The judge's willingness to stake his professional reputation on this unconventional placement provided the kind of official endorsement that could satisfy territorial requirements while honoring community wisdom. His verdict shocked no one in the crowd, but it surprised even him with its departure from cautious legal precedent in favor of human compassion and community commitment. As the sun set behind the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that seemed to bless the small frontier town, Inspector Thornton closed her clipboard and looked directly at Martha and the twins, with an expression none of them had expected to see. "Mrs. Whitfield, I hereby approve your petition for permanent guardianship of Samuel and Sarah, effective immediately," she announced, her official tone softening with what might have been genuine warmth. "This community has demonstrated the kind of support and commitment that our territorial guidelines aspire to achieve. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause as Martha knelt to embrace both children, tears streaming down her face as she realized that her unexpected family was now officially and permanently hers. Samuel and Sarah buried their faces against her shoulders. Their long journey finally ended in the safety and love they had never dared hope to find again. In that moment, as the three of them held each other while their new community celebrated around them, the abandoned twins had found not just a home, but a place where they truly belonged, and Martha had discovered that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the most unlikely challenges.